Charles, do you want to begin?
Well, I guess the first part of the answer is that you're not one of the members of the new upper class that I'm worried about, because you still remember what it was like in another America, a very different America from the one you live in right now. In the same way that somebody who now owns a chain of auto repair shops and is worth $30 million, but he did it because he grew up as a mechanic. He remembers what it was like. And the person who went to Yale Law School in 1974 in your same class, who was white, but who grew up in a working class home, he is also like you. And what I am worried about are the members of who are rising to positions of great authority in this country who don't remember any other America except the America in the bubble. So I am not being dismissive of race as a distinctive feature of your experience, but the aspect of your experience which is a strength is that you have lived in all sorts of different Americas and you still remember. So race is important. It's still more important that you've had that multidimensional experience.
George?
If I understand your question, the way the people I spent time with identify themselves cuts all sorts of ways. Yeah, consumerism is a big one, and you could point to some foolish expenditures by people who didn't have the money to buy what they bought because they felt they had to in order to be minimal members of our society as one cost of consumer capitalism. Dean Price thinks of entrepreneurship as the highest good, and he reveres Steve Jobs. And if he knew who Peter Thiel was, he would revere Peter Thiel, who is in the book. And out in Silicon Valley, that is the religion. The religion is entrepreneurship. Although it has a way of quickly leading to fairly top-down corporate hierarchies once they succeed, because it turns out that Facebook is in some ways a more opaque and hierarchical company than IBM, even though the spirit of it, the ethos is we're all hackers here. We're all just guys in jeans, and it is guys in jeans, staying up all night coding. So I guess in some ways the imagination is of, in many parts of the country and in many people, the lonely individual who is going to either make it or not. And the celebrity culture reinforces that 100 times, so that Steve Jobs represents business success. And it's a galvanizing force. I think it has a good side to it, which is that it fuels aspiration, and in Dean Price, it fuels resilience. Without that dream, the Napoleon Hill dream, Dean might be dead now by his own hand. But at the same time, I think it distorts. It distorts the true picture, because although Dean has identified Walmart as evil and Steve Jobs as good, Sam Walton was Steve Jobs. I mean, he's another of the celebrities I profiled in the book. Sam Walton was a kind of a self-made American hero who became the face of this corporation, and until his death, Walmart was actually thought of as a great American story. It was after that folksy small-town face was gone, and very quickly, like within months, that all the negative stories about Walmart started to come out. So in a way, the self-made entrepreneur has a disguising effect on what a Walmart or an Apple or any number of other entities in the private sector are actually doing in the lives of someone like Dean Price.
It seemed to me more about a kind of testing out, an experiment that would leave traces on my young mind that would inform the next idea, the next task, the next unknown. In art as experience, Dewey extends an idea of engaged experience into a sense of being present in what he called a heightened vitality. He construed aesthetic experience outward, so to speak, writing that instead of signifying being shut up within one's own private feelings and sensations, it signifies active and alert commerce with the world. It signifies complete interpenetration of self and the world, of objects and events. Experiment and experience are etymologically rooted in the Latin word experire, to attempt or try. For Dewey, this experiment-experience link was central to his thinking about democratic processes. Art making was what he called the germ, demonstrating how thinking and acting are in a vital continuum by which, when humans fully engage, either as makers or as recipients, viewers or listeners, we perceive how such experiences can and do change our perception of the world. The mid-20th century poet Charles Olson wrote, "What does not change is the will to change." Obama's first campaign slogan, "Change you can believe in." Today, we might ask if America has lost its will to change. Pragmatism, then, as I understand it, is a method in which thinking and doing are intimately related through an awareness of processes that give rise to a new thinking and new forms. And when William James says truth is what happens to an idea, he implies that truth itself is mobile, something that emerges over time. Truth is a kind of testing ground. That James chose the verb happens excites me. It derives from the Old English hap, which means chance or fate, and so we get happenstance and haphazard. To happen, then, is to occur or take place, but with the sense of destiny, outcome, fate. Ideas become true by way of what happens to them, indeed, according to their use. Use and usefulness are at the core of pragmatism and is one reason that is often confused with pragmatic, which suggests doing something with its use value foremost, rather than this more subtle sense of wearing or trying it out over time, a kind of experiment. To become a poet is distinctly unpragmatic in the common sense. But to write poems with a sense of the pragmatic method is another matter. If truth is what happens to an idea, we may ask what has happened to the following ideas. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A pragmatist is not going to imagine that truths are self-evident. Perhaps the only phrase that a pragmatist might fully accept here is the pursuit of happiness.
The third problem is that we live proudly with empty freedoms we don't use. The problem is not that there is no freedom of speech. The problem is that nobody actually uses it. And insofar as people use it, our problem is not freedom of speech, it is the willingness to listen. With the internet, anybody can say anything he or she wants. It's a sewer of undifferentiated opinion that all looks alike. The conformity of our relationship to it, of course, is aggravated, exacerbated, by Google and by Amazon, by the algorithms that really allow us to see only things we already know. Most people go to public lectures to hear something they already believe. Nobody goes to a public lecture to actually have his or her blood pressure heightened unless the doctor has ordered it, for fear that they might actually faint dead away, to hear something they don't want to hear. People take dissent personally, and that stops the conversation. When we talk really about freedoms, what point is the freedom when we are about to enter a presidential debate in our democracy in which it is absolutely implausible that in the process of the debate, one candidate will be convinced that her or his position is wrong on the basis of evidence and a good argument? Imagine I would vote for anyone who would say, that's an argument I hadn't thought of, and the facts you have brought to bear make my position wrong? Completely implausible. In our technological space, the fourth problem is that the empty freedoms, I would call the empty freedoms, and the intolerance of dissent leads actually to absolute inability for people in political life and in public life to compromise. Consensus is achieved by self-censorship and silence. People withdraw. They concede to a consensus which is not about enthusiasm, but about essentially giving up, retreating into a private space. They don't want to debate the proposition. So our ability to compromise is much reduced. We see that, of course, in politics. And the other, of course, is our ability to lose gracefully. Part of living in a democracy is the ability actually to lose gracefully. The whole principle of a jury trial, assuming that the trial is a level playing field.
I did not come here to shoulder the burden of racial representation. Everyone in this room is implicated in the politics of race, even in this putatively post-racial moment. But I would simply say that it is a fact that most Black and most Latino kids of whatever class go to schools where most of the other students belong to the same race or ethnicity, right? We live in an age of legal equality, but I think for all these pockets of social equality that do exist in our society, these social equalities persist in public education, the radical defunding at every level, which has occurred with the consolidation of neoliberal capitalism as a form of governance, not just as a way of organizing our economy, but as a form of political governance. I'm sure many of you in the audience read the series in the New York Times recently about all of these young people who bought into, I use that phrase advisedly, bought into the notion that if they could get an education, they would be able to achieve class mobility, and now they're paying off astronomical loans. Why? Because we as a society have decided that it's just not important to invest in the education of our young people. So there, and you know, the largest population of prisoners, increasing population of prisoners, are young women of color. So, I mean, if you look at education, if you look at incarceration, if you look at employment, unemployment in 1963, Black unemployment in 1963, August of 1963, when the March on Washington occurred, was 10%. When the March on Washington occurred, if it was a march, I think of it as a neoliberal spectacle. In 2013, black unemployment in the United States was 13%, right? So we're not living, the story that we need to tell is not a story of inevitable and singular and continuing progress. It is a story of uneven development, and given the multiple insecurities that characterize the lives of people of color in the United States who have disproportionately suffered from the Great Recession, I think it is important in comparing to hold on to both ends of the chain. Yes, things on the whole are better than they were in 1960, but things for many people of color in the United States are as bad, and indeed in some places, we could even say, given the level of immiseration, worse. That's just a fact.
This book is a true story. It's a work of book-length journalism. And I say that because what I'm going to tell you sounds untrue. But it happened, and it happened in America, and I think it has a lot to tell us about what it means to be American today. So it's really about two men, and you've asked me to introduce the first of them, Raisuddin Bhuiyan, who goes for short by Race, R-A-I-S, is, like so many of the people who came to this country over the generations, a kind of striving immigrant. He is from Bangladesh originally, comes to America in 1999, and people got here in a lot of ways over the generations. And some people came here out of desperation. Some people came here fleeing persecution. But a lot of people who came here, and this is a sort of undertold part of the story, a lot of people who came here were fleeing perfectly decent circumstances that were decent to everybody else around them except them. And that's actually a big part of the American story and a kind of the American DNA. We're peopled by people who couldn't stand things that their brothers and sisters often could. And he was one of those. He had a great life. He was an Air Force officer in his country, which was the top in that country. Bangladesh is a big peacekeeping country, so he would have been a fighter pilot, peacekeeper around the world, made good money, been in chauffeur-driven cars for the rest of his life. But something kind of nibbled on his ear repeatedly and always pushed him to the next thing. And that's how he'd gotten to the Air Force. And then once he was in, the whisper was, you got to get out and you got to go to America. If you want to do anything, you got to go to America. And in a time when we're very depressed about our country, it's worth remembering that in most countries in the world, a lot of people still get that whisper. So he got the whisper, and he came here. He came here any way he could. And now you have to imagine, Air Force officer starts working in a gas station in Dallas, Texas, in the summer of 2001, first in New York and then goes to Dallas. And it's a tough existence. He's working 5 a.m. to late night every day. But he has this very clear picture. He's going to work here a few more months. He's going to save up just enough money to enroll himself in community college. He's going to study IT. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. He's going to marry his fiancée by the end of the year in 2001. And he's going to become a big-time IT guy. And then 9/11 happens, and he meets Mark Stroman, who's the other character. Mark Stroman comes from a very different world, to say the least, a world that, from what I understand, you've been talking about in some of these other sessions. Mark Stroman grows out of a white working class in and around the Dallas, Texas area that in his family, but also in many families, has progressively been worse off each of the last 3 generations. And so his grandparents kind of owned a construction business and had a pretty big house, and his parents seemed to sort of work and have a home, but a lot of alcoholism, a lot of abuse, but they kind of had the rudiments of a stable life. And then he is one of these guys who is easy to think of. I mean, he ended up being a very horrible guy, as I'll explain in a second, but he grows out of a world where there are a lot of guys like him. and he's in and out of the law from age 9, getting arrested for things that involve slingshots at first, and then sort of graduate to chrome nunchucks, and then graduate to stealing a guy's pickup truck, and then graduate to, wielding a knife at some Mexican kids in high school, and progressively he ends up where a lot of American boys are ending up right now, which is first juvenile detention, and then prison, and serves time on 2 different offenses. Each time is let out after a few months on 6 and 8 year sentences. And so it's kind of this deadbeat, but works. He's not part of the welfare story. He works as a stone cutter. He works in a body shop, not the skincare, the other kind of body shop. And after 9/11, this adrift man who had never been able to hold down a kind of decent life, and who was, as his wife put it, lived by the doctrine of hurt or be hurt, who had grown up with immense trauma within his family. After 9/11, this man became convinced that 9/11 was the purpose of his life, and that the US government was going to do nothing. So he would not have been able to foresee that we're still in these places, including some that had nothing to do with 9/11. He felt that only he, Mark Stroman, could avenge these attacks. So he drove around to 3 gas stations in Dallas, and he shot the clerk behind these 3 gas station counters.
Thinking they were
Arabs, which is Dallas for Arabs, and thinking that he was fighting.
Do you believe that outside the academy, but actually in those who hold power right now in American society, there's a meritocracy to select the true holders of power? And then for George, I have a quick question. It's an impossible question. I have a friend who made me ask real questions, so I'm asking a question I don't know the answer to at all, but do with it what you will. I don't know what it means to have an idea of America at any snapshot in time. But if you can say something about what is different now between now and 1986 or 1996, that where, this portrait of the political nature of isolation is so important. So I want you to stay away from the mechanical part, but move to the idea part. The idea of America that Price might have had 20 years ago and how that has changed. I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
Evocative statement of some of the same things I would say, and I can join in later, adding perhaps some numbers to go with the characterizations that George will present. Okay, let's talk about the new upper class. New upper class is different from the upper middle class. It's a much smaller group. It's the people who run the country, if you want to think of it that way. The broad elite are the people who are the most important physicians and attorneys and college professors and television station owners in local cities. The narrow elite are the people who run the nation's politics and economics and culture. They are overwhelmingly located in just a very few centers. New York City and its surrounding area, Washington, D.C., its surrounding area, Hollywood, Los Angeles, and of course increasingly now in Silicon Valley, which is a whole new center of a major effect on both the culture and the economy of the United States. The thing I want to do in my few minutes is first to give you a quick sense of where the new upper class came from, because I don't think it's a problem that has been caused by government policy. I think it is a function of the way the world works and has worked over the last half century, and we aren't going to get rid of it by any of the ordinary, we aren't going to get rid of it, period. And then I will turn very briefly to my problems with the new upper class. How did it come about? Essentially, we had 2 broad phenomena go on during the 20th century, and especially the last half of the 20th century. The first of these was that cognitive ability, plain, simple old brains, became worth a whole lot more in the marketplace than it was before. Consider the case of somebody who has very high visual spatial skills that translate into such things as mathematical skills and also, by the way, programming skills, and has absolutely no social grace whatsoever. You would not trust this guy to go across the street and convince the guy at 7-Eleven to sell him a loaf of bread. But he's really good at this arcane skill set. How could he make a living in 1920? He could be an actuary, basically. He couldn't even be a teacher of mathematics, really, if he has so little social skills. What can he do in 2015? Well, he has to start by juggling the offers from Google and from the quantitative hedge funds in New York City, because he is worth a fortune to them for that same skill set, and they don't care if he has any social skills whatsoever. But the same thing has gone on throughout the whole occupational structure. It makes a big difference how much money you're worth if you're an attorney. If what attorneys do is write wills and attend to the small, ordinary affairs of life, and they have individual clients who pay for these. And that's basically what lawyers did back in the 1920s and 1930s. And corporate lawyers made corporate salaries, which are good, but didn't make them fabulously wealthy. If you have a situation in which you have an international merger of companies that involves billions of dollars, and you have the ability to negotiate that incredibly complex job, you are worth a commission of a couple of $1 million to do that. If you can navigate the labyrinth of Washington bureaucracy, you can make a difference to the bottom line of a corporation if you can get a regulation worded correctly that makes you worth 4 figures an hour. Same thing is true of all the other ways in which the economy has simply just gotten much bigger.
Thomas Jefferson was the founder who most understood the failure of the Constitution. And in Jefferson's telling, the failure of the Constitution was that it had failed to provide, it failed to give freedom to the people, it had failed to provide a space where this freedom could be exercised. We had legislators at the federal government, and we had legislatures at the state level and at the county level. And we had mayors, but we didn't have places where the people would come together and experience the freedom of acting together in self-government. We let go of the town councils. Jefferson had a proposal for wards, breaking the county into wards and having each ward be self-government. And the failure of the Constitution to include that low level, that local level for Jefferson of politics led, in Arendt's telling, to the loss of the treasure, the loss of this multiplication of powers. Because what happened? In big legislatures, in states, and in big administrative bodies, and in the federal government, the people had no experience of power. So what did they do? They let the governors govern. And as the governors govern, the people say, it's not my responsibility. All I have to do is vote every couple of years. The people get corrupted. And so Arendt says, what we see in America is the corruption of the people. What could happen, and what indeed has happened over and over again since, was that the representative organs should become corrupt and perverted. But such corruption was not likely to be due, and hardly ever has been due, to a conspiracy of the representative organs against the people whom they represented. Corruption in this kind of government is much more likely to spring from the midst of society, that is, from the people themselves. I wanted to start with David Bromwich, if I could. You offered a more skeptical approach to the idea of America this morning. America, the idea of exceptionalism, the idea that there's a dream.
The idea of any exceptionalism.
The idea of any
not excluding America.
Any exceptionalism. I'm wondering, having just heard both Larry Lessig and Zephyr Teachout talk about the need to couch this campaign in a kind of American idea, what your response to that is?
I'm really glad you asked me that. Without seeming to recant any of the skepticism I showed toward the idea of exceptionalism in general in a person or a nation, it seems important to add, and they've done it for me, Larry Lessig and Zephyr Teachout, with what they just demonstrated, that within any nation, there are good and bad tendencies, and it's up to the citizen to choose to ally himself or herself with what we take to be the good and build on that. And some of those tendencies are discernible and inferable from our history. So I liked very much, in particular, what Zephyr Teachout said about using history aggressively. That's what we do. But we care about the truth. And so I had a small reservation about her saying, if your father's a monster, take the best of him. No, if your father's a monster, he's a monster. Tell the truth about him and find someone else close enough to build on.